They poisoned my lake to stop me from fishing. Yeah, you heard that right. I showed up early one morning, coffee in hand, ready for the calm of my usual spot, only to freeze in disbelief. Dead fish floated like tiny gray ghosts across the water, the surface streaked with an unnatural, shimmering blue. A sharp chemical stench cut through the morning air, making my stomach twist. Whoever did this clearly wanted to send a message to make me back down, but they didn't think it through. The same water they poisoned feeds the whole neighborhood. Now I'm staring at a lake that should be mine, wondering who would go this far and why. Life in our little lakeside community had always felt peaceful, almost idyllic. Nestled among rolling hills and thick groves of pine and oak, our neighborhood was the kind of place people drove past on their way to somewhere else and only wished they lived there. But for those of us lucky enough to call it home, it was more than a place. It was our daily rhythm, our sanctuary, the backdrop for countless family memories. Mornings were painted with mist rising off the lake, sunlight glinting off water that was usually calm enough to mirror the sky. The smell of pine and wet earth filled the air, and the quiet hum of nature created a sense of safety that few cities could replicate. My mornings, almost without fail, began at the water's edge. Coffee in hand, I would sit on the weathered wooden dock, letting the world wake around me. Fishing was more than a hobby. It was a ritual. It gave structure to my day, a meditative focus, and a rare chance to disconnect from the noise of life and the demands of work. The lake had always been generous. I knew its moods, the way the wind shifted the ripples, the patterns of the fish, the subtle signs that rain was coming. Over the years, I had formed a quiet understanding with the water, a bond that went beyond ownership or recreation. Our house sat a short walk from the lake, tucked into a gentle slope that gave us a perfect view of both sunrise and the winding path of the water. Friends and family loved visiting, drawn to the serenity and the charm of small wooden cabins that dotted the shoreline. On weekends, neighbors would sometimes gather to swap stories, share fishing tips, or watch the sun dip behind the distant hills. There was an unspoken rhythm to our lives, a pattern that seemed eternal. We were part of a community that felt tight-knit, where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. That sense of security, however, was more fragile than I realized. Our HOA, which had once seemed like a harmless organizer of community events and minor maintenance projects, had begun to assert itself in ways that were quietly intimidating. At first it was small, reminders about lawn heights, notifications about paint colors, occasional notes about property lines, nothing serious, nothing that seemed threatening. Most residents accepted these as minor inconveniences, part of the price for living in a well-kept neighborhood. I tried to do the same, paying attention to every letter, every posted guideline, every suggestion that might later be twisted into a violation. But the HOA had a way of creeping in, subtle at first, like a shadow stretching over the sun. Their rules were numerous, often contradictory, and enforced inconsistently, which created tension among neighbors who had previously coexisted peacefully. The board members were mostly residents themselves, but a few enjoyed wielding their influence like a weapon, testing boundaries, asserting dominance over even the smallest decisions. People whispered about fines that appeared out of nowhere, unexplained fees, and arbitrary compliance checks. It was the kind of bureaucracy that feels innocuous on paper, but begins to suffocate when applied to real life. I had mainly kept to myself, preferring to avoid conflict. I mowed my lawn on schedule, repainted the deck when the letter suggested fading colors, and made sure the dock was kept tidy. Most of the neighbors were cordial and friendly. Still, there was always an undercurrent of competition, a sense that someone was watching, ready to report the slightest misstep. In this environment, even simple pleasures like fishing became acts of negotiation. I made sure to know the rules, to comply with seasonal restrictions, and to document my activities, always careful not to give the HOA any reason to challenge me. Yet, the further I looked, the more I realized that rules were just one tool. Power, influence, and fear were the real instruments at play. The lake itself was a source of both pride and tension. As the only significant body of water in our community, it had long been a gathering place, not just for recreation, but for small ecological studies, weekend picnics, and quiet reflection. Over time, it had become a symbol of ownership and control, who had access, who maintained the shoreline, who decided what could and couldn't happen on its banks. On paper, it was public for residents, but in practice, power dictated privileges. I had always assumed that as long as I respected the rules, as long as I didn't make waves, literally or figuratively, I would be left alone. That assumption would prove dangerously naive. Subtle signs of trouble had appeared before I even realized it. A note, unsigned, slipped under my door mentioned that some residents had concerns about fishing times. A comment at a casual weekend gathering hinted at proper procedures that apparently weren't being followed. A neighbor, who had always been polite, suddenly gave me a cold, wary smile as if I were an intruder on my own property. Each incident on its own seemed trivial, almost laughable. But when strung together, they formed a pattern, one that hinted at something darker lurking beneath the polite veneer of our lakeside haven. The board meetings were where the undercurrents became visible, though even there the threat was subtle. Discussions about maintenance budgets, water usage, and fishing regulations seemed mundane at first, almost procedural. But I began to notice glances exchanged between certain board members when my name came up. Questions about my activities at the lake were asked in neutral tones. Still, the timing and intensity of the scrutiny suggested that my presence, or perhaps my independence, was being noted. I couldn't yet define a threat, but an uneasy tension had settled over the routine of my life, like the first chill before a storm. And then there were the stories. Not rumors in the sense of gossip, but incidents that had quietly escalated over the years. People are receiving fines for minor infractions that seem to come out of nowhere. Neighbors are pressured to comply with arbitrary rules, leading some to move away quietly rather than confront the board. I had never thought I would be in that position, at the center of an invisible battlefield, caught between a community's surface-level calm and the simmering power plays behind closed doors. I continued my morning routines, unaware of how quickly the stakes were rising. Fishing, tending to the dock, walking along the water's edge, these simple pleasures became acts of vigilance. Every unusual noise, every odd movement across the lake, my eyes followed with an instinct that was both protective and anxious. The lake, my haven, was no longer entirely safe, and the creeping shadow of authority hinted that any misstep could be exploited. Looking back, there were warning signs I ignored, the way certain board members lingered near my property, the subtle questions from neighbors about permits or proper conduct, even the occasional murmur about enforcing rules more strictly. Each was a thread, innocuous alone, but forming a web that would soon trap me. My assumption that common sense and fairness would prevail was about to be tested in ways I could never have imagined. Life in the neighborhood, with its calm mornings and the quiet lapping of lake water against the dock, was about to be upended. Rules, power, and petty disputes were no longer abstract concepts. They were real, invasive, and threatening. And as I would soon learn, the lake I thought was my peaceful retreat could become the very stage for a conflict I never expected. A struggle that would challenge not just my enjoyment of the water, but the same safety and well-being of the community. The stage was set. I didn't know it yet. It started with a notice slipped under my door one gray morning. The envelope was plain, almost bureaucratic, but the words inside hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. A violation had been reported. My dock, they claimed, extended too far into the water. The letter was vague on measurements, deadlines, or even who had filed the complaint. They demanded immediate correction or risked escalating fines. I stared at the paper, disbelief clawing at me. I had maintained that dock for years, always within what I thought were the accepted boundaries. How could this suddenly be a problem? That was only the beginning. Over the next week, I noticed minor but pointed intrusions. Flyers appeared near the lake warning residents of unauthorized activities. A neighbor who had once smiled and waved now gave me a hard, unreadable stare whenever I passed. Even casual chats about fishing times felt like veiled interrogations. Every moment at the lake, every routine morning was laced with tension. It was no longer a sanctuary. It felt like walking a tightrope over a pit I couldn't see. Then came the fines. One after another, they appeared in my mailbox, each more absurd than the last. A note claiming my fishing line violated aquatic safety regulations. Another stated that the way I stored my tackle box was a fire hazard. Each fine was carefully worded, citing obscure clauses buried in the HOA's 300-page handbook. It became clear they weren't concerned about safety or rules. They wanted control. And the more I tried to comply, the more arbitrary their demands became. The harassment escalated. One morning, I arrived at the lake to find a new official-looking sign posted on the dock. Access restricted, residents only, during HOA hours. Hours? No one had mentioned hours before. I double-checked my letters, my records, and even my neighbor's docks. There was no mention of this new rule anywhere except now, staring me in the face. I tried calling the board, hoping for clarification. Every attempt was met with silence, vague promises to review the matter, or worse, thinly veiled threats about penalties. The most shocking escalation came when I discovered evidence that someone had been tampering with the lake itself. A sheen of unnatural color floated across the water near my fishing spot, and the fish seemed fewer, their movements sluggish. The morning sun glinted off surfaces streaked in subtle shades of green and blue, the kind of unnatural tint that sets your stomach twisting. My first thought was pollution, an accident maybe, but there were no construction sites nearby, no industrial runoff, no plausible natural cause. Something deliberate had happened. I began documenting everything, photographing the lake, recording times and dates, keeping meticulous logs of every notice, fine, and interaction. But the more I recorded, the more they seemed to escalate. An unmarked truck was spotted near the lake late at night, its engine humming as shadowed figures moved equipment I couldn't identify. A sense of being watched crept over me, gnawing at the quiet confidence I had always felt in my home. Even simple chores, mowing the lawn, walking the dog, felt like acts performed under surveillance. Each action potentially used against me. Neighbors who once shared casual pleasantries began dropping hints or warnings disguised as advice. "Be careful about the dock," one would murmur, eyes darting. "Some rules are tricky here." Others outright avoided interaction, perhaps fearing they'd be drawn into the conflict. I felt isolated, surrounded by an invisible wall of scrutiny, unsure who could be trusted. The more I sought allies, the more apparent it became that fear and loyalty to the HOA dictated behavior. Then the meeting that changed everything arrived. I was summoned to a board hearing, a formal gathering to review my compliance with lake regulations. The notice was curt, demanding attendance under threat of escalating fines. I walked in expecting a procedural discussion, a chance to clarify the dock issue. What I encountered instead was a room thick with hostility, seated board members whose expressions betrayed satisfaction at my arrival. The discussion was rapid, legalistic, and overwhelmingly one-sided. Each objection I raised was met with counterclaims I had never heard before, obscure bylaws I had never seen, and veiled accusations of misconduct. By the time I left that meeting, my sense of control had evaporated. The board had imposed temporary restrictions, citing vague safety concerns. It warned that future violations could result in penalties reaching hundreds of dollars per day. My mornings at the lake, once a source of calm and joy, now felt like navigating a battlefield strewn with invisible traps. The dock that had been my refuge now seemed like a target painted with a bullseye. It wasn't just the bureaucracy. The petty cruelty revealed itself in small, almost imperceptible ways that slowly eroded my patience. My fishing line was cut once after getting tangled with something foreign. A section of the dock was deliberately loosened, requiring urgent repair. The equipment I had left neatly on the shore disappeared, replaced with cryptic notes admonishing me for improper storage. Each incident was subtle, plausible as an accident, but the cumulative pattern screamed of intentional harassment. The tension spilled into every aspect of life. Sleep became restless, and mornings began with a knot in my stomach instead of anticipation. Even the dog sensed the change, hesitating at the edge of the dock, ears pricked at the slightest disturbance. My neighbors' gazes felt accusatory. Strangers on their morning walks seemed to be measuring my every move. Each day brought the same question: what would happen next? And would the HOA, or whoever was orchestrating these actions, escalate beyond petty fines into something hazardous? Then the first undeniable proof of malicious intent appeared. Late one night, I returned to the lake to find the water itself altered. Chemical traces floated on the surface, shimmering unnaturally in the moonlight. The fish were gone from my usual spot. The unmistakable scent of chemicals hung in the air, acrid and sharp, burning my nose. This wasn't a misinterpreted rule or a bureaucratic oversight. This was a deliberate act to prevent me from fishing. Panic surged through me, accompanied by a sick, hollow anger. Someone had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. I began questioning everyone around me. Neighbors who seemed neutral now felt suspect. Board members' words replayed in my mind. Those glances, those smiles that didn't reach the eyes, suddenly carried weight. I considered hiring professionals to test the water, but I also feared drawing attention, which could escalate the situation further. Every choice carried risk. Every action was a calculated gamble. The lake, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a minefield of uncertainty and potential peril. Despite the growing fear, a stubborn determination took root. I refused to leave or surrender my rights. Fishing wasn't just a pastime anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, a defiance of intimidation and manipulation. I meticulously planned my mornings, observing patterns, watching for intrusions, documenting anomalies. Every unusual sound, every flicker of movement near the water, every suspicious vehicle became part of a growing dossier, evidence that could no longer be ignored. But the more I fought back quietly, the more subtle attacks emerged. Signs appeared warning of restricted activities with no dates or clarification. Previously ignored, notices about water usage now demand logs of hours spent fishing and equipment used. Even minor repairs to the dock triggered formal letters, threatening penalties for non-compliance. It was a relentless escalation, each move designed to frustrate, intimidate, and wear me down. And yet, despite everything, the community still maintained its facade of serenity. Families walked dogs, children played on nearby lawns, neighbors exchanged polite greetings, and the lake reflected calm skies. Beneath this idyllic surface, however, a storm was brewing, invisible to outsiders but utterly consuming to those caught in its center. I was living in a tension-filled world where every routine act carried potential consequences, where the line between everyday life and conflict had blurred entirely. Then came the message that confirmed my worst fears. An anonymous note left in my mailbox without explanation warned me to stop wasting the board's patience or face consequences. The handwriting was deliberately nondescript. The tone cold, calculated, almost gleeful in its menace. I realized the harassment was no longer just about rules or control. It was about sending a message, about asserting dominance, about fear. Someone wanted me intimidated, trapped, silenced, and I had no idea who or how far they were willing to go. It was in that moment, standing at the edge of a lake that had once symbolized peace, that I understood the stakes. This was no longer about a dock or fishing lines or even arbitrary bylaws. It was about power, control, and survival within a hostile community. Every serene morning could now hide a new threat. Every action, even the simplest, could trigger retaliation. The idyllic lakeside life I once cherished was gone, replaced with constant vigilance, suspicion, and an escalating battle with invisible opponents. The lake that had fed my soul and grounded my life had become a battlefield, a symbol of everything at risk. And I had to find a way to respond, not just to reclaim my dock, my fishing rights, or my peace of mind, but to survive the unseen war that had erupted around me. I knew one thing for sure: the next confrontation would define the course of this battle, and I had to be ready. The next morning, I approached the lake cautiously, scanning for any signs of tampering. The water had a faint, oily sheen, and a few small fish floated near the edges, lifeless. My stomach churned. Whoever was behind this wasn't just sending warnings, they were escalating, testing boundaries, daring me to react. Each step I took along the dock felt heavier, charged with the knowledge that I was being watched, judged, and provoked. The serenity of the lake had vanished, replaced by suspicion, and the creeping dread of unknown enemies. I decided to escalate my own defenses. I set up cameras at strategic points, documented every unusual occurrence, and began keeping detailed records of my observations. Every vehicle parked near the lake, every unfamiliar face, every suspicious sound was logged. This wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Yet even as I took precautions, the board and whoever supported them found new ways to apply pressure. Letters arrived demanding explanations for minor deviations in dock maintenance, citations for improper storage of fishing equipment, and notifications that my water usage would be under scrutiny. Each one felt like a scalpel, precise and deliberate, designed to wear me down slowly. Neighbors started whispering more openly, offering cryptic warnings about people who think they own the lake, or rules that are changing every week. I sensed fear in their voices, a caution that suggested retaliation wasn't just possible, it had already happened to others. One resident, usually warm and talkative, confessed quietly that they had once challenged the board and faced constant harassment afterward. They had moved their dock and repainted their house according to the strictest interpretations of bylaws. Yet they still received fines for reasons that made no sense. It was a glimpse of what I was stepping into, a world where fairness had no role and intimidation ruled. Then came a letter that felt like a personal attack rather than an official notice. It accused me of unauthorized manipulation of lake resources. It threatened a hearing with the possibility of daily fines exceeding hundreds of dollars. The wording was vague, the language legalistic, and the tone almost gleeful in its implied menace. I reread it several times, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. My dock, my fishing lines, even the water I relied on, had become weapons in a battle I had never agreed to join. The realization hit. The HOA, or someone among its allies, was willing to destroy what I loved to assert control. One evening, as I walked the perimeter of my property, I noticed that the vegetation along the shoreline had been disturbed. The footprints were fresh, heading toward the lake, and carried the unmistakable signs of human interference. It was no longer subtle. Someone had been on my property without permission, likely observing, possibly tampering further with the lake. My sense of violation mixed with fear. The war had moved from legal notices to physical intrusion. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow across the water, was a reminder that I was being targeted, and that my response had to be measured, intelligent, and decisive. The community meetings became even more volatile. Board members, emboldened by a lack of resistance, began publicly scrutinizing my behavior, questioning the legitimacy of my dock, the timing of my fishing trips, and the way I interacted with the lake. I tried to defend myself calmly, but the room seemed designed to frustrate any explanation. Time limits on speaking, constant interruptions, and the casual dismissal of my evidence left me feeling cornered. Each meeting ended with veiled threats of further fines, inspections, or restrictions. The pattern was unmistakable: relentless pressure to submit, retreat, or face increasingly severe consequences. In the midst of this, I discovered something horrifying. The HOA controlled a significant portion of the water supply feeding the lake. The same water that had been a source of calm and sustenance for my family and neighbors could now be leveraged as a weapon. It dawned on me that tampering with the lake wasn't just about fishing, it could affect everyone downstream. Whoever orchestrated this didn't understand the full impact of their actions, or perhaps they did, and were willing to risk the health and safety of the entire community to prove a point. Panic mixed with righteous indignation. The stakes had just jumped to a level I could no longer ignore. I reached out to environmental experts and local authorities, carefully documenting evidence and maintaining detailed logs. The chemical traces, the dying fish, the disrupted shoreline, all pointed to deliberate contamination. I realized that confrontation was inevitable. Remaining passive meant accepting threats, harassment, and potential public harm. Every day the tension escalated, and the danger to my property and community became more apparent. The HOA's petty rules had transformed into something dangerous, their abstract power now tangible and destructive. Then, one morning, the sabotage became undeniable. I arrived at my usual fishing spot to find the water darkened with an unnatural, almost fluorescent blue streak running through it. Fish floated lifeless, the chemical smell thick in the air, making my eyes sting. Panic and fury surged simultaneously. Whoever had done this believed they were silencing me, making a statement. But they had overstepped in a way that could affect the entire neighborhood. I knew then that the situation was no longer just about my rights. It was about preventing harm, proving accountability, and standing against injustice. The psychological toll was immense. Every routine act, walking the dock, unloading gear, simply observing the lake, carried the weight of potential confrontation or sabotage. Sleep was restless, mornings filled with apprehension. Even casual interactions with neighbors carried suspicion. Anyone could be an informant, a sympathizer, or an accomplice. The once relaxing ritual of fishing had become a high-stakes exercise in vigilance, strategy, and courage. I started noticing patterns in the harassment. Notices were timed to coincide with my trips to the lake. Surveillance increased on days I had planned longer fishing sessions. Subtle manipulations of the dock and equipment suggested careful observation and calculated interference. Whoever was behind this had knowledge, intent, and perhaps a network of allies. The HOA's reach extended far beyond letters and meetings. It had seeped into daily life, creating an environment where every action was scrutinized, every decision questioned. By now, my determination had hardened into a plan. I would not allow the intimidation to continue unchecked. Evidence would be gathered, experts consulted, authorities informed, and neighbors quietly rallied. Every intrusion, every chemical trace, every letter or fine was logged, stored, and analyzed. I realized that the very same body that claimed to protect community interests was using fear as a tool. If I didn't respond strategically, the consequences could escalate further, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood dependent on the lake. Late one night, after documenting a particularly aggressive act, the chemical streak stretching across the water, I stood on the dock, staring at the surface, anger and adrenaline coursing through me. The peaceful morning rituals I had once cherished now felt like distant memories. The board, whoever orchestrated these attacks, and the system they controlled had forced me into a corner. I understood that the next confrontation could not be passive, could not rely on polite explanations or minor appeals. Action had to be decisive, evidence irrefutable, and strategy unassailable. And then came the final warning before the full escalation. A letter, unmarked, slid under my door in the pre-dawn hours, words typed sharply. Cease all activities on the lake or face consequences beyond fines. No signature, no explanation. Fear mingled with fury. Whoever wrote this believed they could intimidate me, bend my resolve, and maintain control over both me and the lake. They were wrong. I now understood that every action I had taken, every precaution, every observation, had led to this point. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the boundaries of power, justice, and accountability in our community. The lake, the dock, the chemical contamination, and the mounting fines had all built to a critical point. The HOA's relentless tactics, the harassment, and the blatant disregard for safety and fairness had created a perfect storm. And as I looked across the water, I realized that what had begun as petty fines and obscure rules had now escalated into a full-blown battle that could not be ignored. The following steps would demand courage, evidence, and a strategy capable of confronting the board's overreach and exposing the truth before irreversible harm occurred. Cliffhanger. The calm of the lake was gone, replaced by a tense standoff where every ripple could signal a threat. Every shadow could be an agent of harassment, and the next move, mine or theirs, would change everything. The tension had reached its breaking point. Every morning I had approached the lake with apprehension, every step measured, every glance over my shoulder calculating potential threats. The harassment, fines, and sabotage had escalated beyond petty disputes. They had become a direct assault on my life, my property, and the well-being of the neighborhood, and the moment had come to confront it head-on. I knew that this confrontation could redefine everything, not just for me, but for the community as a whole. It began with preparation. I gathered all the evidence I had meticulously collected over months. Photographs of the chemical contamination, videos of suspicious activity, copies of every notice and fine, and logs of unusual incidents. Every camera angle, every time-stamped entry, every seemingly minor observation now formed a cohesive dossier that painted a picture of deliberate intimidation. For weeks, I had feared what action might be necessary, but the scale of their escalation left me no choice. Passive compliance was no longer an option. In the morning, when I decided to act, the lake was deceptively calm. The mist hovered over the water, and the sun had just begun to cast a pale glow across the rippling surface. I carried my evidence, cameras in hand, knowing that today would be the day the HOA's reign of arbitrary power met its match. My plan was simple: confront the board and present irrefutable proof of their misconduct, while ensuring local authorities and neighbors witnessed the full scope of their actions. Every detail had to be precise. Any misstep could be twisted against me. The board's regular meeting hall was a small, austere room, the walls lined with framed photos of neighborhood gatherings and long-forgotten awards for community excellence. Inside, the board members sat with practiced composure, faces carefully neutral, eyes glinting with an unsettling mix of curiosity and condescension. They had no idea what I had prepared. From my vantage point, I could see the subtle tension in their posture, the brief, almost imperceptible exchanges that betrayed impatience. They thought they controlled the room, controlled the narrative, controlled me. I knew they were about to learn how wrong they were. I began with calm, measured words, outlining my observations, the letters, the fines, and the escalating disruptions. I laid out photographs of the lake, highlighting the chemical streaks and the dead fish floating near the docks. Each piece of evidence was accompanied by time-stamped logs, showing a consistent pattern of deliberate interference. I could see eyes shift, subtle twitches, and glances exchanged among board members as the reality of my claims sank in. The room, once dominated by their authority, was now tense with uncertainty. As I continued, I introduced the most damning evidence: video footage from cameras I had set up along the shoreline. Unmarked trucks, shadowed figures, and nighttime activity were all captured in high resolution. The time-stamped recordings showed individuals moving suspicious equipment toward the water, footprints tracing paths directly to the areas I used most. There was no ambiguity. The harassment had been orchestrated, deliberate, and premeditated. The board's previous denials and dismissals now teetered on the edge of exposure. I could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Board members who had exuded confidence now shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging whispered words that were barely audible but unmistakable in tone. I pressed forward, presenting chemical analysis from an independent environmental expert, confirming the presence of hazardous compounds introduced into the lake. The expert's report outlined the danger to aquatic life and, crucially, to residents relying on the water supply. The room went still. The weight of undeniable proof had begun to dismantle the facade of control they had maintained for so long. Then came the final piece, the letter I had received anonymously, the veiled threat warning me to cease my activities. I held it aloft, letting the thin envelope speak volumes in its stark, typed menace. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. For the first time, the board could no longer dismiss me as a single, isolated complainer. The accumulated evidence created a narrative they could not spin, an undeniable record of harassment, manipulation, and potential endangerment of the community. One board member, previously smug and dismissive, finally spoke. Their voice was measured but trembled slightly as they tried to regain control. They questioned the validity of the evidence, raised procedural objections, and attempted to intimidate me with references to bylaws and board authority. But I had anticipated every challenge. Each objection was countered with documents, timestamps, expert statements, and visual proof. The tide had turned. Their authority no longer commanded the room. The audience, neighbors, and local authorities I had invited, watched silently, absorbing the unfolding revelations. At that moment, one neighbor, previously hesitant, stepped forward to share their own experiences. They described fines for minor infractions, harassment over trivial matters, and their fear of retaliation. Others followed, recounting incidents that mirrored my own. The room, once under the control of a confident few, now vibrated with collective testimony. The board's attempts at intimidation were crumbling under the weight of communal accountability. Every whispered concern, every previously hidden incident, converged to expose a pattern of abuse that could no longer be ignored. Despite the mounting pressure, a sense of fear lingered. I knew the board would not concede easily, and some of them still sought to manipulate perception, to assert control through procedural loopholes. But the evidence was overwhelming. I had anticipated their moves, prepared counters, and marshaled support in a way that left little room for evasion. The confrontation had reached its apex, a precise, calculated collision between authority and accountability, fear and courage, intimidation and truth. Then a dramatic twist unfolded. A live feed from the cameras showed activity at the lake in real time, a vehicle approaching the dock, shadows moving suspiciously near the water. The timing was impeccable. The footage confirmed ongoing attempts to manipulate and sabotage the lake, even as the meeting proceeded. The board's expressions betrayed shock and panic. What had seemed like abstract allegations were now irrefutably visible, documented, undeniable, and live. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to electric, charged with disbelief and the dawning realization that their actions were not only exposed, but continuing in real time. I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The cameras captured everything. The expert testimony verified the chemical contamination, the logs documented a consistent pattern, and the community witnesses corroborated each point. The board had underestimated the extent of my preparation, the depth of my resolve, and the necessity of public accountability. Their attempts at control were crumbling, with each minute exposing more evidence of wrongdoing and each second highlighting their reckless abuse of power. It was then that I made the decisive move. I demanded immediate action, cessation of all interference, a public acknowledgement of the violations, and remediation of the chemical contamination. The room erupted in murmurs, some supportive, some defensive. The board struggled to regain composure, but the weight of exposure, legal and social, left them vulnerable. Their authority, once unchallenged, now relied solely on procedural loopholes that could no longer mask their misconduct. One board member attempted to escalate, threatening legal retaliation and citing obscure clauses designed to intimidate residents. I countered with a clear, documented explanation of the violations, evidence of ongoing criminal activity, and the potential for environmental and civil liability. The room fell into silence, the only sound the faint hum of the ventilation system. I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by the knowledge that the confrontation was not yet fully resolved. Then came the public humiliation, subtle, yet undeniable. Video footage, previously shared only with authorities, was projected to the assembled neighbors. The previously confident board members were now forced to face the reality of their actions in front of those they sought to control. Gasps, murmurs, and incredulous whispers rippled through the room. The board's attempts to assert dominance were nullified by the undeniable visual evidence of their misconduct, the meticulous records of harassment, and the collective testimony of affected residents. I could see the shift in their demeanor, a mixture of fear, anger, and desperation. Their tactics, once effective, had no purchase in the face of such overwhelming exposure. The psychological edge they had wielded so carefully for months slipped through their fingers. And yet, even in this moment of triumph, a sense of tension remained. They were powerful, entrenched, and capable of further maneuvers. The confrontation was not merely about proving wrongdoing, it was about reclaiming the lake, restoring safety, and preventing further escalation. The peak of the conflict arrived when the board was forced to address the ongoing contamination in real time. Evidence of chemical tampering, captured live by cameras, was undeniable. Their prior denials fell apart under scrutiny. Authorities present at the meeting documented every detail, noting potential violations of environmental law and public safety statutes. The room, once dominated by intimidation, now echoed with accountability. The board members, previously untouchable, were suddenly vulnerable to legal, communal, and environmental consequences. I felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. The confrontation had reached a point where the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Every effort, every precaution, every documented observation had led to this moment: exposure, accountability, and the potential for real change. The tension that had consumed months of my life now culminated in undeniable proof that the board's overreach could not continue unchecked. And yet, the final move had not been completed. While the evidence was overwhelming, the board's reaction hinted at lingering threats, appeals, or last-minute attempts to regain control. I knew vigilance was still required, that the lake's safety, my rights, and the community's well-being depended on sustained action. The confrontation had reached its zenith, the climax of months of harassment, sabotage, and intimidation, but the resolution was yet to unfold. I took one last look at the board members, their expressions a mix of disbelief, anger, and begrudging respect. The community, witnessing the unmasking of abuse, began to murmur approval, nod in solidarity, and discuss next steps for remediation. The power dynamic had shifted, the abusive tactics exposed, and the groundwork laid for both accountability and restoration. Yet even as I left the meeting room, a lingering awareness remained. This battle was far from over, but the momentum had decisively turned in my favor. Cliffhanger ending, the lake, once a symbol of calm and retreat, had become the stage for justice. But the final resolution, the cleanup, and the proper accountability of those responsible still awaited. Every ripple, every shadow, and every lingering trace of their sabotage hinted at the challenges yet to come, leaving the community and me on the edge of a new chapter, teetering between fear and relief. The days following the confrontation were unlike anything I had experienced in months. The weight that had pressed on my chest, the constant tension that made even the simplest morning walk feel like a test, began to lift, though not completely. The lake, once a battlefield of intimidation, slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, though the scars of the conflict remained visible: floating debris from the sabotage, faint chemical residues, and the subtle unease among some neighbors. Yet even amid the lingering reminders of what had occurred, there was a sense of relief and cautious optimism. Justice, in some form, had been initiated, and the community could begin to heal. Authorities acted swiftly once the evidence was presented. Environmental inspectors arrived to conduct thorough tests of the lake, confirming the presence of chemical contaminants and establishing a clear timeline of deliberate tampering. The HOA board, confronted with irrefutable proof, faced an unprecedented level of scrutiny. Legal notices were issued, demanding remediation of the contaminated water, the restoration of the dock area, and strict compliance with environmental safety regulations. The fines and harassment that had once been wielded against me were now scrutinized under a legal lens, revealing not just overreach but potential criminal negligence. The psychological impact on the board was immediate. The veneer of control that had once allowed them to dictate the community with subtle threats and arbitrary rules was shattered. Their attempts to intimidate residents were exposed publicly, and several members resigned quietly, unable to face the combined pressure of legal action, community scrutiny, and the overwhelming weight of evidence. Those who remained were forced to operate under far stricter oversight, with their powers curtailed and subjected to review by impartial authorities. The lesson was clear: abuse of authority could no longer thrive in secrecy. For me, the personal victory was profound, though tempered by the intensity of what had been endured. I reclaimed my dock, restored my fishing lines, and began the slow process of repairing the lake ecosystem with guidance from environmental experts. Fish were reintroduced, water quality was monitored, and safety measures implemented to ensure that no future tampering could occur. Each morning, as I stepped onto the dock, coffee in hand, the lake no longer felt like a threat, but a reclaimed sanctuary, a symbol of resilience, patience, and careful strategy. The act of fishing regained its meditative quality, though now underscored by the knowledge of the battle that had been fought to protect it. The neighborhood itself shifted as a result of the confrontation. Residents who had previously avoided involvement began engaging more actively in community oversight, demanding transparency and accountability from the HOA. Meetings that had once been dominated by a few authoritative voices were now open forums for discussion. With clear guidelines for fair participation and input, neighbors spoke more freely, aware that collective observation and documentation could prevent the abuses that had plagued the lake and property for so long. What had been a fractured, fearful community began to show signs of cohesion and empowerment. Social dynamics evolved as well. Some residents who had supported the board passively or silently openly acknowledged the harassment and voiced their relief at seeing it confronted. Others, who had directly experienced intimidation, found solidarity in shared experience, fostering connections that had previously been absent. Even previously antagonistic neighbors approached cautiously, offering gestures of peace, perhaps recognizing the futility of petty disputes in the face of collective accountability. The community, once held hostage by fear, began to rediscover the trust and camaraderie that had originally drawn people to this lakeside haven. The financial impact was significant, but ultimately manageable. The fines and penalties levied against the HOA were directed toward remediation efforts, ensuring the lake's safety and the restoration of environmental balance. Legal fees were partially offset by insurance and community support, highlighting the importance of preparation and documentation when confronting organized harassment. While the process required time, effort, and resources, it also served as a critical deterrent, signaling that any future abuse of authority would be met with equally serious consequences. Personally, the ordeal transformed my perspective on property, community, and vigilance. I became more aware of the subtle dynamics that could turn ordinary oversight into oppressive control, and more determined to maintain active engagement with both neighbors and governing bodies. The lake, once a passive backdrop to my daily life, had become a symbol of accountability, resilience, and the importance of standing firm when confronted with injustice. Each ripple of water, each flicker of sunlight on the surface, now carried the weight of lessons learned. That rights, safety, and peace of mind require both awareness and courage to defend. Over time, the lake returned to its natural state, healthier and cleaner than before, thanks to the combined efforts of experts and concerned residents. Fish populations rebounded, vegetation recovered, and water clarity improved. The process was gradual, a reminder that restoration after deliberate harm takes patience and dedication. Yet the visible recovery mirrored the restoration of community confidence and the reclaiming of personal agency. What had been marred by fear and sabotage now reflected resilience and collective action. The HOA itself underwent structural reform. Leadership roles were reevaluated, oversight mechanisms were strengthened, and guidelines were implemented to prevent unilateral decisions that could endanger residents or their property. Training and transparency initiatives were introduced to ensure that future board members understood the limits of their authority and the importance of ethical governance. While bureaucracy could never be eliminated entirely, the systemic abuse that had caused months of conflict was significantly curtailed, providing a safer environment for all residents. My own approach to community engagement evolved. I became a resource for neighbors, sharing my experience, guiding them in understanding their rights, documenting unusual activity, and encouraging proactive participation in meetings. Awareness and education became a form of empowerment, ensuring that the manipulations and intimidation tactics that had once gone unnoticed would not recur. Residents began to take ownership of oversight, creating informal networks of observation and reporting that reinforced accountability while fostering a culture of mutual support. Emotionally, the resolution brought a complex mixture of relief, pride, and lingering wariness. The confrontation had required strategic thinking, courage, and meticulous documentation, and the victory reinforced the value of preparation and resilience. At the same time, the experience left a permanent mark, a heightened awareness that even the most idyllic communities can harbor latent threats, and that vigilance is an essential component of preserving peace and personal rights. The lake, once a serene escape, now carried the weight of both conflict and triumph. The broader lesson extended beyond property lines and HOA bylaws. It highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority, the vulnerability of communities to subtle intimidation, and the power of collective documentation and legal recourse. By confronting harassment decisively, the community demonstrated that fear could be overcome, that rules are meaningful only when applied fairly, and that deliberate harm, no matter how subtle, carries consequences. It was a powerful reminder that accountability is not optional. It is essential for the safety, trust, and well-being of everyone involved. Community events gradually returned to normal, though now imbued with a stronger sense of awareness. Social gatherings at the lake, once casual and carefree, became occasions where residents could celebrate resilience and accountability. Fishing tournaments, family picnics, and morning walks took on renewed significance, symbolizing the restoration of both personal enjoyment and communal harmony. The lake was no longer just a body of water. It was a testament to the triumph of vigilance, courage, and the refusal to be intimidated. One particularly symbolic moment occurred weeks after the confrontation, when I stood on the dock at sunrise watching the first fish leap from the restored water. The lake shimmered, pure and reflective, a living reminder of what had been defended and reclaimed. The sense of peace was profound, yet underscored by the knowledge that this tranquility was hard-won. Every ripple seemed to whisper a reminder: vigilance, preparation, and courage can restore what was threatened, and even the most insidious attempts at control can be exposed and overcome. Neighboring communities began taking notice of our experience. Word spread about the confrontation, the evidence, and the subsequent reforms, sparking discussions about HOA accountability, residents' rights, and the importance of environmental stewardship. Our story became a case study in both resilience and the dangers of unchecked authority, inspiring others to take proactive measures to safeguard their own communities. The ripple effect extended far beyond our lake, influencing conversations about fairness, transparency, and collective action. Reflecting on the ordeal, the most profound realization was that conflict often reveals the true character of both individuals and communities. The HOA's actions had tested patience, courage, and ethical boundaries, exposing flaws, fears, and power dynamics that had previously gone unexamined. The resolution not only addressed immediate harm, but also established lasting standards for fairness, transparency, and accountability. It reaffirmed that injustice, when confronted strategically and collectively, can be corrected, and that persistence and courage are potent tools against intimidation. Ultimately, the experience transformed both the lake and the neighborhood. Where once there had been fear, mistrust, and manipulation, there was now cautious optimism, strengthened oversight, and a shared commitment to fairness. Residents understood that complacency allows abuse to thrive, while engagement, documentation, and collective action can dismantle even the most entrenched patterns of intimidation. The lake remained a sanctuary, but it was now also a symbol, a reminder that rights, safety, and peace must be actively defended, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can prevail. The emotional impact lingered. I found a renewed sense of purpose, not just in enjoying my property, but in advocating for the principles that had protected it. Every morning, the ritual of stepping onto the dock, casting a line, and listening to the gentle lapping of water became an affirmation of resilience. It was a small but meaningful victory, a daily reminder that deliberate intimidation could be met with preparation, courage, and strategic action. The lake reflected not only sunlight, but the hard-won triumph of standing firm against wrongdoing. The final lesson, which I carried into every subsequent interaction and decision, was deceptively simple. Awareness, courage, and persistence matter. Even when rules are misused, when authority is abused, and when intimidation seems overwhelming, documenting facts, seeking support, and confronting the issue methodically can restore balance. The lake, the neighborhood, and my sense of agency all bore witness to that truth. What had been a site of harassment became a symbol of accountability and community resilience. Proof that deliberate harm could be exposed and rectified, and that justice, once activated, has a lasting impact. As the lake returned to serenity, the board's influence waned. The remaining members operated under new scrutiny, their ability to impose arbitrary fines curtailed, and the culture of fear replaced with transparency and mutual oversight. Residents, empowered by the experience, remained vigilant, ensuring that abuses would not recur. The ecosystem, both natural and social, had been restored. The balance of power, once skewed toward intimidation, now leaned toward fairness, accountability, and communal respect. Standing at the dock months later, watching the sun glint across the restored waters, I reflected on the journey from intimidation to triumph. The ordeal had tested every ounce of patience, courage, and strategic thinking. The HOA's attempts to control, manipulate, and sabotage had ultimately failed because deliberate action, thorough preparation, and community engagement could counter even sustained abuse. The lake was calm, the neighborhood stronger, and the lessons learned indelibly etched into memory. And yet the final takeaway lingered. Clear and profound, power thrives where accountability falters, and fear persists where courage is absent. By standing firm, documenting meticulously, and confronting injustice decisively, even a single resident could challenge entrenched authority, protect the community, and reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The lake, once poisoned and threatened, now mirrored the triumph of vigilance, resilience, and strategic action, a living testament to the enduring power of truth and justice. Every ripple on the water seemed to echo a single question. When faced with intimidation or abuse of power, would you stand by or would you act? The answer in our community had become abundantly clear.